Okay, so we're all here to learn about fungal ecology, and I want to welcome all of you from across the internet, wherever you are. I am hosting you from Portland, Maine, as a settler on unceded Abenaki land. I can't talk to you about fungal ecology or encourage you to go out and observe mushrooms without thinking about land access, land stewardship, about traditional ecological knowledge. One of the many lessons I'm learning from observing fungi is that everything is connected. Mycology, as a scientific study of fungi, connects to history, to economics, to politics, to people. We can infinitely zoom in and out of its webs. And my hope in sharing with you today is that through the lens of fungal ecology, we can reflect on our human relationships to inform more equitable communities. So this image is from the New Moon Mycology Summit, organized by the Mycelium Underground. There are some pretty inspiring folks in the mycology community if you want to check them out. And this is me. I discovered fungi through my love of trees. I'm pretty sure that I was listening to a podcast interview with Suzanne Simard about her research on the transfer of nutrients between different tree species through a common mycelial network. And soon after, I attended a webinar with Peter McCoy, coinciding with the publishing of Radical Mycology. And what really drew me into this community and the greater network around it was how social justice was something that was important to wrap into the science. And my nerdiness just keeps growing from there. I currently am a content creator for Northspore, and I just want to help people learn how to appreciate these pretty incredible cohabitants. And I want to be humble in sharing what I've learned with you. This is definitely still sort of tip of the iceberg knowledge about these complex relationships, and I'm not an expert because there's so much to learn yet, and I definitely welcome feedback. I also want to take a moment to thank my teachers across the queendoms for sharing their wisdom and to be in gratitude for their generosity. So I want to start by reading you this poem by Sylvia Plath. Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes, our noses take hold on the loam, acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding. Even the paving, our hammers, our rams, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes, we diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered asking, little or nothing, so many of us, so many of us. We are shelves, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible. Nudgers and shovers in spite of ourselves, our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door. I really appreciate this as a sort of extended metaphor for what is underground, being potent and subversive, and the perspective of we as a community or collective body, and emergence as an uprising and power shift. So what is ecology? Very baseline, ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and their environment. So that includes all living organisms, plants, animals, fungi, humans, and all of the biotic and abiotic factors or interactions they have. So with rocks and minerals, the air, nutrient cyclings, trophic webs specifically have to do with the transfer of energy in systems, so food chains. And fungi play a pretty crucial role in all of these processes. You can see them right at the center of this diagram, and they basically connect cycles of life and decay. To think more specifically about fungal ecology, here's a lion's mane in 2 consecutive years. To think about the ecology, we have to examine the hole created by the pileated woodpecker to hunt for insects. The fungus that's myceliating the wood likely softened the tissues, making it easier for both the insects and the woodpecker to burrow through the tree. These holes provide more airflow and oxygen, which are conditions for fruiting mushrooms. And these systems get more complex when we zoom in and out. What about the bugs who live on the fungi and the bugs who live on the bugs that live on the fungi? And what about the whole forest and migration paths of birds and their predators? The web is infinitely large and all of it is connected. So getting right into the meat of it, I'm going to walk you through the different roles that fungi play in their environment. And when we get to the end of each section, I'll pose some questions for us to reflect on, to try to take some lessons for human ecologies. And at the end, we'll do some breakout groups to discuss questions or ideas that come up for any of you and take a moment to share with the rest of us. So it's worth noting that fungi are not always discrete in the way that they relate. So depending on their environment, they can switch their roles. So there's crossovers between categories like saprotrophs and pathogens. But generally speaking, our saprotrophic fungi are decomposers, digesting and consuming non-living materials. Mycorrhizal fungi are our mutualistic symbionts and require a plant partner as a host, or perhaps a companion to survive and to thrive. Parasitic fungi rely on living organisms as a food source and sometimes a shelter. They have the potential to become pathogenic, which means they can cause disease in their host. Endophytic fungi live inside other organisms. Endo means inside. And they're often neutral or beneficial to their host, but have the potential to become pathogenic. And last but not least are lichen, which are a community of organisms that include at least 1 alga and 2 fungi. So saprotrophic fungi include a lot of our mushrooms that we eat and almost all of the mushrooms that we can cultivate. So shiitakes and oysters, button mushrooms, maitake. If we look a little bit closer, other foods and beverages are also made by saprobes, like tempeh with rhizopus or beer with Saccharomyces. All fungi are heterotrophic, which means they do not produce their own food. They cannot convert carbons into sugars for energy. But what makes fungi really unique is that they digest their food outside of their body. So they excrete enzymes into their environment, which break down food sources before they're absorbed. These enzymes are responsible for decomposition, without which our forest would be massive piles of dead trees. And fungi are responsible for almost 90% of all the decomposition on Earth. It's pretty impressive. Saprobes are essential to returning valuable nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur back into systems through decomposition of organic and inorganic materials, whether it's wood or food or pollen or even the remains of other organisms. So in that, they complete the arc with bacteria between life and death by sublimating and recycling waste. As tenders of death, it's interesting that the highest rates of decomposition happen in winter under snowpack, which is kind of mind-blowing that there's so much activity happening unseen in a season associated with death. We can also think of saprobes like chemical masters, unlocking unavailable nutrients and making them soluble for other organisms through their extracellular, outside of their body, enzymatic digestion. Fungi have this special ability to break down complex molecules into simpler ones, which includes lignin, which is the compound that makes wood, structural, and complex hydrocarbons like petroleum products. It also includes solubilizing nitrogen into forms that are easily uptaken or easily absorbed by plants, and degrading rock into minerals and metal ions. Our wood rot fungi are the only organisms really equipped to process lignin, which is a compound that's resistant to decay. Different types of them to varying degrees. So there's white rot, which excel at degrading lignin, and brown rot specializes in degrading cellulose, another compound in plants. And soft rot, which is the third type, can degrade both, but is a little bit slower at degrading lignin. So after brown rot digests most of the cellulose from wood, what's left is mostly lignin. This material, which looks pretty cubical or stringy and has a spongy texture, allows it to hold water and nutrients and give shelter to tiny creatures. Since most of our terrestrial carbon is tied up in lignin, wood rot fungi are crucial to carbon cycles and the creation of soil humus. A byproduct of this recomposition is the softening up of wood for other creatures to create shelters, and part of why leaving standing dead trees called snags in forests is important. It's vital habitat. It's also fun to note that bioluminescent fungi, like this jack-o'-lantern, are white rots. And these fungi are also pretty heavy hitters in natural environments because they play a role in cleaning up contamination, which is also called microremediation. They can uptake heavy metals and degrade plastics and other petroleum products. Fungi are considered keystone organisms. And keystone organisms are like the glue that holds systems together. Their presence in an environment greatly affects other creatures. Saprobes are one of the first organisms to inhabit disturbed environments, especially burn sites, creating, in combination with lichen, simple soils, and transporting water to barren or rocky sites. This path makes way for bacteria to grow, and in this context, we can think of them as guiding succession. What does white rot mean? So it's just two sorts of distinctions of wood decaying fungi. There's the white rot and the brown rot, and I think it has to do with the appearance of the mycelium that runs through the wood, and they each degrade different parts of the wood. Okay, so some insects have co-evolved with decomposer fungi to farm them for food, including ants, termites, ambrosia beetles, and wasps. In the case of the atta ant, which is a leaf cutter, it's also an obligate symbiont, which means that it needs to be in relation to another organism to survive. The atta ants collect leaf cuttings and they bring them back to their colony to feed their Leucoagaricus fungi, which grows inside. In exchange, the fungi develops hyphal masses as a food source for the ant. Hyphae, if you're not familiar with that term, is the growing point of fungi, part of the vegetative body, sort of like the shoot or the sprout of a plant. So the ants regulate airflow and humidity of the fungus through air passages, opening and closing like ports in it to create a microclimate for the fungi to survive. There's also a whole dynamic microbiome that's involved in this relationship that helps to keep competitor fungi out. And these sorts of relationships sometimes beg the question, who's farming who? Did the fungi support the ants for their own benefit? And does this apply to us too? Humans are attracted to the often charismatic fruiting bodies of fungi. Mushrooms entice us to eat them. So perhaps we unwittingly are helping to spread spores, depending on your harvest style, like if you're harvesting baskets. And we help to proliferate our decomposing kin. It's also important for us to reimagine ourselves as vital parts of our ecosystems in this way. And moving beyond our terrestrial ecosystems, the spores of these fungi interact with condensation in the air, becoming nuclei for raindrops. With huge spore loads, this could mean that fungi play a part in cloud and rain formation. This is a quote about these guys. Our environment is shaped by what we choose to observe. But while our most abundant products are waste, these byproducts of our activities are so plentiful and often so strangely formed, it is either difficult or impossible to contemplate them, let alone safely hold them or fold them into a substrate that is able or willing to digest them. Working with waste challenges cultural taboos, as well as presenting an environmental risk. The same low-tech solutions for processing waste also present a real solution to reconnecting our bodies to the earth. All we have to do is first pull out the thorn of ingrained prejudice. And this is written by Nance Clem, who is a pretty accomplished remediator. So some questions to think on. What does it mean to tend to death and or waste? What can we learn about digesting or composting cultural or personal trauma? And what can these decayers of organic matter teach us about our own waste streams? So now we're at our parasitic fungi, which is maybe the dark side of the fungal queendom. There are two types of parasites, necrotrophs, which ultimately kill their hosts, and biotrophs, which simply feed on them. And it's in the best interest of a biotroph to keep, or for their host to survive. The word parasite comes with a pretty heavy negative connotation, but maybe we can see them more neutrally as opportunists or vocal parts of our ecosystems. If we zoom out from our ego-driven, anthropocentric view, how do the roles of pathogens change? Some of these fungi aren't so foreign to us either. Lots of them are food and medicines, like chaga, which is a sclerotia that grows on birch trees and is at risk of being over-harvested. And cordyceps, another medicinal mushroom that's gotten fairly popular recently in Western culture. It infects insect pupae and influences their behavior, sometimes compelling them to climb as high as they can before bursting out of their bodies to release their spores. Just pretty sci-fi sounding. That's a cordyceps. If you are a farmer, a gardener, or general lover of plants, you may be familiar with this group. Downy mildew inevitably takes out basil plants every year. Rusts form on the leaves of fruit trees, and sometimes seedlings die off from damping off. As opportunists, pathogenic fungi often appear in unhealthy or otherwise altered ecosystems. Perhaps they can be an indicator of these environments. Lack of diversity in an ecosystem, absence of mycorrhizal support, depleted or contaminated soils, and introduction of non-native species can all contribute to the optimal conditions for these fungi to take hold. We can think of it like getting a cold. If we've been stressed out and eating poorly and sleep deprived, we might be more susceptible to infection. Yes, pathogenic fungi have incredible destructive potential. Our forests in the US are perhaps forever altered by them. Chestnut blight, which was brought to the US in the early 1900s by infected Japanese trees, wiped out an estimated 400 billion trees. It's also interesting that in Europe, the chestnut blight has somehow been mitigated by viral infection of the pathogenic fungi. In the case of Dutch elm disease, beetles act as vectors, spreading the spores of the fungi into the wounds caused by their nibbling. And these types of blights are considered necrotrophic. With such incredible destructive power, it's important that we learn more about how they work, especially in the face of our massive agricultural systems. Right now, there's fungal blight sweeping through avocado and banana farms. And maybe that's because of a lack of diversity. These are monocropped and cloned. How does that impact food supply, access, and economies?
I have a question.
Sure.
In relation to what you were just talking about, does it you've come about the fungus come about in order to right a kind of wrong, like it'll bring something to the circumstances to force a healing. I don't know if I'm being clear or not.
I
I
think
mean, yeah, I'm sorry.
I think
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. That like, are they indicating some kind of underlying problem?
Right, and because they're also living just an entirely different creature from us, we don't get what they're doing, and if we left them alone, they could probably heal circumstances or something. I'm just wondering if that's been considered.
That is a great question and something that I am definitely curious about. Like, how do we change our perspective to like re-examine them outside of our own like human perspective? Yeah, thank you. So the largest living organism on Earth is a honey mushroom called Armillaria austraea, which covers about 2,400 acres in Oregon and is about 9,000 years old. It cuts off nutrient supplies in their host trees with thick black rhizomorphs, which look like black cords between the outer layers of bark and inner wood. Is it possible that the armillaria is accelerating forest succession by culling weak trees or selectively thinning? And what are the impacts of a change in species composition due to pathogenic activity? Again, the loss of living trees in an ecosystem creates snags or hollow logs, which provide valuable habitat for lots of creatures and eventually degrade and return organic matter into the soil. But not all of our pathogenic fungi are quite so devastating. Biotrophs don't need to kill their host to survive. They just glean nutrients from them. And some of them are even really tasty. Corn smut, also called huitlacoche or Ustalago matus, transforms corn kernels into large savory morsels, often used in Central American cuisine. There's also a fungi that parasitizes other fungi called lobster mushrooms, and another type called Entoloma abortivum, which parasitizes honey mushrooms, creating what folks call shrimp of the woods. And not all pathogenic fungi are obligate parasites. Some switch between their roles depending on their environment or other reasons that we don't quite know. Candida albicans, a yeast responsible for thrush and yeast infections, commonly occurs in and around our orifices and in our guts, but it can cause problems when its population isn't balanced within the microbiome. Another Nance Clem quote, what are we willing to risk when we don't believe our livelihoods and vitality depend on the relational pathways that connect our neighborhoods, the health of our urban wildlife, the breathability of our air and soil? When we externalize the questions, when we externalize the answers. This gets me thinking, how do parasites view their habitats? Do they? Or are they too self-absorbed in their consumptive economies to realize that they are supported by something larger than themselves? Parasite is a word coined in the early 16th century from the word para, meaning besides, and sitos, meaning wheat. And it came to mean one who eats at the table of another. Parasitism is a natural occurrence. In the continuum of relationships, it is just one way of interrelating. Parasites are unable to synthesize their own food, so they acquire these foods from a host. Parasites reduce a host's biological fitness as they increase their own vitality by exploiting food, water, heat, and habitat. And while it is true that a host evolves in response to a parasitic attack, a parasite in turn evolves in response to a host's defense. Further, a parasite can eventually kill their host, though it's not in the best interest of the parasite. So some questions. What do these indicators of disturbance or imbalance reveal? Can we shift from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric lens? And what can parasites teach us about ideas of abundance and scarcity? Many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with some mycorrhizal fungi. Many of our prized culinary mushrooms are in this group, including porcini, and chanterelles and matsutake and some of the morels. Because of their complex relationships, they evade cultivation by humans. Many are generalists or cosmopolitan, associating with plants across families, and sometimes at the same time, like social butterflies buzzing through a party. While some are particular to one host at a specific time and specific families, almost 95% of all plants associate with the mycorrhizal partner, with the exception of brassicas, which are our cabbage family, and some other plants. The mycelial web that weaves underground can extend exponentially further than a plant's roots, allowing the fungi to access hard-to-reach minerals and water. In exchange for water and essential nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, the plant provides the fungi with carbon in the form of sugars. They barter with their abundances. This relationship is especially important in harsh conditions like nutrient-depleted soils or disturbed environments where a plant would otherwise struggle to survive. We're also learning that these relationships not only transfer nutrients, but also toxins. Some plants release chemicals which suppress the growth of nearby plants, and mycorrhizal fungi can extend their reach. When mycorrhizal fungi begin to establish a relationship with a plant, there's a chemical signaling that happens between them. Essentially, the fungi ask permission to enter into the plant's roots or cell wall, and maybe this is some sort of biological consent. Mycorrhizal fungi are separated into two groups, ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal, and they're distinguished by their host specificity and their mechanisms for associating. So ecto, which means outside, their hyphae extend into the plant root pretty shallowly, but between the cell walls. And a very thin layer of fungal tissue completely envelops the root structure of the partner plant, which is usually a tree. This is one of the most sophisticated symbioses between plants and fungi. Many of them produce edible mushrooms, and most are host-specific, but some are generalists. Endomycorrhizas, endo means inside. For a long time, scientists believed that all members of this group extended their hyphae to penetrate the cell wall of their host. But we know now that these relationships are much more complex than we first thought. They do extend deeper into the root than ectomycorrhizas, but some of them are still inside of the cell walls. They have more diversity of plant association, both woody and herbaceous plants. And there's 6 subgroups of endomycorrhizas, but we'll concentrate on just a few of them today. So we'll start with the ectomycorrhiza. Suzanne Simard's work on mother trees describes the wood wide web of a common mycelial network which links trees in a stand across species, acting as a conduit for nutrients. The network not only transports nutrients, but also serves as a means of communication. When predation or pathogenic activity occurs in a stand, the message can be passed through the network to warn other individuals so they can boost their defenses. Some people compare the mycelial network to the internet or liken it to a central nervous system of a forest. More recent research by Simard and her colleagues on Douglas fir stands stressed by drought and insect defoliation showed that stress signals and photosynthetic carbon was transferred via the mycorrhizal network to young ponderosa pines, which were perhaps better adapted to their changing environment. This is pretty significant in thinking about the cooperation between species and shows promise in the recovery of ecosystems after disturbance. Many of these mycorrhizal fungi also form a sheath over their host plant's roots called a mantle, which protects the plants from other organisms. And sometimes they even produce antibiotics. These sorts of associations help to mitigate the effects of some stresses like soil salinity or saltiness and toxicity. Along with arbuscular mycorrhiza, which we'll get to next, they can solubilize minerals from rock and are a huge contribution to phosphorus cycles. So you can see in this diagram just like how how much further the mycorrhizal partner extends these trees' roots. Some of our ectomycorrhizal fungi form hypogeous or below ground fruit bodies as opposed to mushrooms. We call these fruit bodies truffles. They have significant impacts in regards to mycophagous relationships. Mycophagous means mushroom eater. These fungi need creatures to unearth them and disperse their spores, so they developed highly aromatic compounds that are only detectable when the spores are mature to attract creatures to dig them up. Some species of small mammals have co-evolved with these fungi, like bandicoots, which have claws and long snouts, and gray squirrels, which only eat the outer rind of stag truffles, leaving the spongy inner core to waft spores into the wind. These sorts of small mammals become more significant as we zoom out and see larger food webs. In Australia, where eucalypt trees dominate the forest, their oily hydrophobic leaves make it difficult for water to reach the soil. Truffle-seeking rodents burrow through the soil in search of their food, and these burrowing points all provide access points for water to infiltrate. Burns are also pretty common in eucalypt forests. These fires seem to increase truffle production and correspondingly mycophagy by creatures like Tasmanian bettongs. These bettongs, which are small marsupials, perhaps filling a niche similar to mice or squirrels here, become a food source for larger animals. By eating the truffles, nutrients stored in the fungal biomass move upward through the food web. So rapid spore dispersal post-fire and the cascade of relations following may point to Ectomycorrhiza as an early successional species after this type of disturbance. Talking about creatures in Australia because of this book called Trees, Truffles, and Beasts, it compares the Pacific Northwest to Australia, and I would highly recommend it. All right, moving on to our endomycorrhiza. So our buscular mycorrhiza account for almost 80% of all of our mycorrhizal associations, by far the most abundant and diverse group. They assist in nitrogen fixation in plants and partner with bacteria to channel nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon and zinc needed for nodulation and fixation. So they help out our nitrogen fixers. They may also redistribute the nitrogen fixed by the rhizobia bacteria to plants that don't form those relationships in a system. Additionally, these fungi produce glomalin, which is a glycoprotein responsible for the tilth in soil. Essentially, glomalin is like a glue which stabilizes the soil, giving it structure and holding it together while still allowing permeability and air pockets. This compound is really important for overall soil health, and there's lots of potential here for supporting your mycorrhizal fungi, getting more glomalin and organic matter into soil matrices to help develop really rich soil. I think a lot about this in regards to agricultural systems and tillage. Orchid mycorrhiza predictably pair with orchids. And orchids are one of the largest families of plants with incredibly complex and irregular flowers. At some point in their life, all orchids stop photosynthesizing and rely on their mycorrhizal partner for support, many of them at the seedling germination stage. Orchid seeds are super small and don't have much in the way of stored nutrients, so the mycorrhizal partner sort of swoops in and gives them a little bit of support so they can grow on their own. Our ericoid mycorrhiza are specific to the Ericaceae family, which are heathers and blueberries and cranberries and rhododendrons and azaleas. If you garden, do orchid farms use them? I don't know. I imagine that they have to use a a mycorrhizal inoculant to propagate unless they're cloning them. So folks who garden probably know that you need to amend the soil around Ericaceae plants with some sort of acid, and that's because their natural environment is highly acidic. They thrive in extreme conditions of the tundra, the boreal forest, and heathlands, where their sandy soil doesn't hold water or nutrients very well. So their fungal partnerships step in to help them access hard-to-reach resources. And last but not least, the monotropoid mycorrhiza. Yes, the ghost pipe. These are one of my favorites. They associate with what we call parasitic plants or mycoheterotrophs, which means they depend on a fungi ally for food. Plants in the Monotropoideae family, like ghost pipe, or snow plant or snowflower and sugar stick, all benefit from these relationships. They lack the familiar green pigment of chlorophyll because they don't photosynthesize. Instead, fungi draw nutrients from a nearby tree to support the growth of this plant. Often, the fungal partner is pretty specific. In the case of ghost pipe or Monotropa uniflora, it pairs with brucellas or lactarius mushrooms. With sugar stick, it pairs with matsutake, which is a coveted mushroom in Japanese food. And the sugar stick, because of this relationship, often leads foragers to find the mushrooms, which is pretty wild. All right, so mycorrhiza fungi. It's tempting to believe that they are deliberate in working together, and perhaps they are. But the beauty of the partnership is how each organism does what it does in order to increase its own wealth or own growth. But as it happens, when the individuals flourish, so does the whole. And this is by Robin Wall Kimmerer. How do we support or provide to other organisms and to each other? In what ways are we interconnected? How do we honor and uplift what is unseen and underground? Endophytic fungi. These types of fungi live in all sorts of creatures, plants, insects, ruminants, even humans. As microscopic organisms, they don't produce mushrooms. Endophytic relationships aren't as well studied as mycorrhizal or saprotrophic, and yet they've been found in the above ground tissues of almost every studied plant, and we estimate that they are present in 95% of all plants. A single plant can host millions of individual endophytes. We think maybe plants and endophytes co-evolved, and that these partnerships are sometimes passed vertically through the tissues and seeds. Unsurprisingly, they're found in diverse ecosystems, from the Arctics to the tropics, in cultivation and in wilderness. As part of the microbiome, they're part of an unseen and complex ecosystem in many living things. There are even endophytes that live in lichen. With insects, endophytes are part of their microbiome, helping to break down complex compounds to aid in digestion with the potential to degrade toxins. They also assist in provisioning nutrients for their host. They can also exist in anaerobic environments like the guts of ruminant animals, like cows. In plants, endophytes may exist neutrally or beneficially until the plant is stressed or weakened, and then they can switch to becoming pathogenic. Perhaps in killing the stressed plant, the endophyte fine-tunes ecosystem health. What's the benefit? Generally speaking, though, the switch to pathogenic behavior is uncommon. Though they mostly exist in the herbaceous tissues of a plant host, so in the leaves or the stems, some of them dwell in root structures and act like mycorrhizal fungi, helping to access nutrients and reducing impacts of stress. As supporters, endophytes have been seen to increase overall growth and productivity of plants, so more fruits, for example, and tomatoes. As protectors, endophytes reduce the impact of abiotic stressors like drought or salinity or saltiness of soil, and they also help to mitigate the intake of toxins from the soil. The degree to which endophytes boost resilience can be pretty remarkable. In one study, crop plants like watermelon and tomatoes were inoculated with thermophilic endophytes, so endophytes which live in extreme heat, and they were kept in 149-degree heat for 10 days, and the plants survived. Without this partnership, neither the plant or the fungi would have survived temperatures above 104 degrees. In response to organic stressors, endophytes can act sort of like bouncers, physically occupying the space where pathogens would otherwise take over. Endophytes can impact other larger organic stressors too, like insects and cattle. Some produce toxins which render their plant host poisonous when nibbled on by other creatures. We see this in fescue grass, which is toxic to livestock, and in oak galls, which are formed to host wasp larvae. When the endophyte moves into tissues of oak galls, it cuts off the food supply for the larvae before it hatches from the egg. The same compounds that endophytes release to help and protect a host plant in distress can promote the production and accumulation of what we call secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites can have great medicinal value. So when we think of a medicinal plant, who's actually responsible for these properties? Is it the plant or the endophyte? And that distinction is still pretty blurry for us. Since the presence of endophytes in a plant can be affected by their environmental factors, can we say that plants grown in ideal environments for their endophytes may be more potent medicinally? These are questions. Adrienne Marie Brown writes in Emergent Strategy about building resilience to enact change on the frontier of social justice. Among her tenets of emergent strategy are: small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. Change is constant, be like water. Never a failure, always a lesson. Move at the speed of trust, and what you pay attention to grows. How do we look beneath the surface for invisible partnerships and alliances? What lessons does the highly localized scale offer? And what do we learn by zooming in and out as a community within the self and beyond? Lichen. Lichen are a symbiont of organisms instead of being organisms in and of themselves. In fact, the word symbiosis was coined specifically to describe lichen, which is something I just learned. 95% of the body of a lichen, or the thallus, is composed of fungal tissue. The fungal component of the community is called a mycobiont, and morphologically appears like a shield containing a greenhouse-like structure. It typically consists of an ascomycete and a basidiomycete yeast. Then there's a photobiont, so the photosynthesizing partner. This is often an algae or cyanobacteria, and sometimes both. The exact composition of lichens keeps evading being pinned down by scientists and varies. And the more that we study these complex organisms, the more we find more partners inside of them. In forest ecosystems, lichen are carbon and nitrogen fixers, as well as absorbers of minerals and elements from the air. They become reservoirs of dew and moisture and seeds. These nutrients are cycled through the ecosystem as lichen fall and decompose and are eaten. Seed banks and canopies can preserve genetics even as disturbance happens on the ground level. Some animals rely on lichen for their food. The black snub-nosed monkey consumes lichen for about 95% of its diet, and in the winter, lichen become a primary food source for keystone species like woodland caribou and reindeer. Outside of food, lichen can protect their environment. Some of them form shields over their plant hosts, like young hardwood saplings, to protect them from being eaten by animals. And some of them are used as camouflage for nesting material for birds and squirrels. In drylands, their varied morphology, or their physical structure, provides shelter for insects. So insects can crawl sort of like in these crusty layers of lichen. They're often found on rock, and lichen can chemically weather the surface of rock, which mobilizes magnesium, iron, and silicon in their environments. This habit of clinging to surfaces unsuitable for other organisms also means that lichen can assist in erosion control and soil stabilization. The community that exists within lichen allow them to exist in some of the most extreme climates. Each organism performs a vital role in the cohabitation and creates the ability to withstand stressors that would individually be their end. The resilience is proven by the proliferation. Lichen occupy more land space than tropical rainforests and needs no soil to become established. In Antarctica, there are only 2 flowering plants and upwards of 450 different types of lichen. Lichen are also important parts of desert ecosystems, living on rocky outcrops exposed to all of the elements, deriving water from mists or fog. Scientists have even brought lichen into space, exposed them to extreme radiation, and successfully revived them simply through rehydration. Their ability to go dormant allows them to persist. In relation to humans, lichen have become environmental indicators. By observing changes in their diversity, accumulation of pollutants in their tissues, and morphological differences, we can see changes in air quality. Another Robin Wall Kimmerer quote. The lichen in a single body unite the 2 great pathways of life. The so-called grazing food chain based on the building up of beings, and the detrital food chain based on taking them apart. Producers and decomposers, the light and the darkness, the givers and receivers wrapped in each other's arms, the warp and the weft of the same blanket, woven so closely that it's impossible to discern the giving from the taking. Some of Earth's oldest beings, lichens, are born from reciprocity. How do we see the lichen community as a microcosm? How do we distinguish individuals? In what ways does collaboration or cohabitation allow for resilience? Hopefully this meme feels applicable after hearing all of the incredible varied ways that fungi relate to their environments.